I already talked about Azure Container Apps, but let me talk about that as a first class citizen, just because architecturally you need to be paying attention to this. For a number of years, Docker came and kind of helped define the meaning of a container image and a running container and how it needed to be, and Linux, because Linux as an operating system has been in dependency hell and backwards compatibility hell for so many years. Containers were an absolutely necessary innovation on top of the Linux kernel, just to be able to run applications in an isolated manner, because the isolation didn't really happen naturally without it. On Windows, that problem, it wasn't as big of a problem as it has been historically on Linux. So with Windows, you can kind of get by and you don't really have that pain so much. So searching for containers on Windows is not as desirable. For example, Azure App Service, which the hosting plan gives you pretty much a full Windows VM, the full Windows operating system, and it's no big deal to run multiple apps on the same app service plan, which in turn run those apps on the same Windows operating system. That kind of works just fine. And so Windows containers, while Windows containers do exist, and there are some people using Windows containers, they're just not as necessary. And so when Microsoft is not putting as heavily investment in them. Now, Kubernetes is also a first-class Azure service, Azure Kubernetes service, but it has so many knobs and so many buttons that most development teams are not going to get a return on investment by actually learning Kubernetes. Now, being able to run a single web application and not even have to worry about an operating system, that's huge. And so Kubernetes has value. What Microsoft is doing with Azure Container Apps is they are taking Azure Kubernetes service and they are putting an app service tooling layer on top of it, so that for the 80% use case, it might even be 95% use case, for the 95% of the types of applications that don't need to twiddle all of the buttons and knobs that Kubernetes exposes and does have available, Azure Container Apps just gives you a few of the most common settings for not only .NET applications, but a lot of other types. So for .NET 6 specifically, and it makes running your application on Kubernetes just as simple as running it in app service. Okay, so that's the vision. It's happening. I can see it happening. There's more work to be done. Last year at this time, it was in public preview. It is released GA, but it's still early. So keep an eye on that. The container apps are perfect for targeted backend jobs, web applications, web API applications, Blazor server side, heck, any kind of web application really, Blazor WebAssembly, and they're super cheap as well. From a Azure build perspective, they're perfect. They're great for production applications, but they're even better for your pre-production environments because they will scale down to idle, meaning they'll scale down to a fraction of a CPU and just enough RAM to keep your application loaded in memory. And it'll do nothing unless that application actually gets a request. And then when the application gets a request, it'll scale up a little bit. And if it sees it starting to get more requests, it'll give it a little bit more memory, a little bit more CPU, up to limits that you establish. And so as a result, you basically get environment almost hibernation while you're sleeping for free. And so you're only paying for storage and a little bit of memory. And so your Azure bill for pre-production environment is going to plummet down to a rounding error. And it'll also save you money in production, because if your user base has some has some seasonality or hours, if your user base is mostly in 1 or 2 or 3 time zones, well, then most of your users are asleep at night in those time zones if you're not supporting global time zones all the time. And even your production environments can almost go to sleep in the middle of the night if only a handful of people are going to be using them in the middle of the night. They can scale way down. So if you're the if you're the one that looks at your Azure bill, then you definitely want to be interested in migrating to Azure Container Apps, which if you're an app service on Azure SQL and Azure Storage right now, then it's going to be a really straightforward transition. And we intend to do some webinars on that and some templates for development environments that have Azure Container Apps as a destination. So keep in touch for that.